September 19, 1940. Warsaw, occupied Poland. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but Captain Witold Pilecki still gripped the cup with both hands, staring at the map spread across the wooden table. Outside, German boots echoed against cobblestones, a sound that had become as constant as his own heartbeat. But what he was about to propose would make even the bravest men question his sanity. "You want to do what?" Major Jerzy Gorski leaned forward, his weathered face creased with disbelief. Pilecki met his superior's gaze without flinching. "I want to get myself arrested by the Gestapo. I want them to send me to Auschwitz." The silence that followed felt heavier than the autumn rain drumming against the windows. 3 other resistance leaders sat motionless around the table, their eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fascination. In all their months of planning sabotage operations, assassinations, and intelligence gathering, no one had ever suggested anything quite this insane, but Witold Pilecki wasn't insane. He was desperate. 6 months earlier, the first reports had begun trickling in from southwestern Poland. A camp. A place called Auschwitz where Polish intellectuals, priests, and resistance fighters simply disappeared. The Germans called it a concentration camp, but the few who managed to send word described something far worse. Pilecki had read every smuggled letter, every whispered account from escaped prisoners who'd managed to crawl back to Warsaw half-dead and hollow-eyed. The stories they told seemed too horrific to believe, yet too detailed to dismiss. Men worked to death in rock quarries. Prisoners shot for looking at guards incorrectly. Experiments conducted on living human beings. But here was the problem that kept Pilecki awake at night: the outside world didn't believe it. The British dismissed the reports as exaggerated propaganda. The Americans were still neutral, focused on their own concerns. Even within the Polish resistance, some commanders questioned whether the accounts were reliable. "Someone needs to get inside," Pilecki had argued in meeting after meeting. "Someone needs to document what's really happening and get word to the Allies. If they truly understood what the Germans are doing, and who exactly do you propose we send on this suicide mission?" Gorski had shot back. "This isn't a military operation, Witold. This is asking a man to walk into hell and somehow come back to tell the story." That's when Pilecki had made his decision. If no one else would volunteer for the impossible, then he would. But why? The question haunted everyone who knew him. Captain Witold Pilecki was 49 years old, a veteran of the Polish-Soviet War, owner of a small estate, husband to Maria, and father to 2 young children. He had everything to live for in a resistance network that desperately needed his leadership. So why would a rational man choose to trade his freedom for the certainty of torture, starvation, and quite possibly death? To understand Pilecki's impossible choice, you have to understand the man himself. Born in 1901 in the Russian partition of Poland, he had grown up in a world where his country didn't exist on any map. Poland had been erased by 3 empires, Russia, Prussia, and Austria-Hungary, but it lived on in the hearts of its people. From childhood, Pilecki had been raised on stories of Polish heroes who sacrificed everything for their homeland. His grandfather had fought in the January uprising of 1863, spending years in Siberian exile rather than submit to Russian rule. His father had joined Józef Pilsudski's underground Polish military organization, risking execution to keep the dream of independence alive. When Poland finally regained independence in 1918, 17-year-old Witold immediately enlisted to defend it. He fought against the Bolsheviks in 1920, was wounded in combat, and stayed in the reserves afterward. Military service wasn't just his profession, it was his calling, but it wasn't patriotism alone that drove him. Those who knew Pilecki described a man with an almost painful sense of moral obligation. When he saw suffering, he couldn't turn away. When he witnessed injustice, he couldn't remain silent. It was both his greatest strength and, some might argue, his fatal flaw. His wife Maria later recalled, "Witold would give his last piece of bread to a hungry stranger, even if it meant our children went without. He simply couldn't bear to see others suffer when he had the power to help." That same compulsion had driven him to join the resistance immediately after Germany invaded Poland in September 1939. While many Poles fled west or simply tried to survive the occupation, Pilecki helped organize the secret Polish army, one of the first resistance movements in occupied Europe. But Auschwitz represented something different. This wasn't about sabotaging German supply lines or gathering intelligence on troop movements. This was about bearing witness to systematic evil and somehow surviving to tell the world. "I have to know," he told his wife the night before his planned arrest. "I have to see it with my own eyes. Because if I don't, Who will believe us? Who will care enough to stop it? Maria begged him to reconsider. Their son Andrei was only 14, their daughter Zofia just 11. They needed their father alive, not dead in some German camp. Pilecki held her close and whispered words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. They need their father to be someone they can be proud of, even if they never see him again. September 19, 1940. 7:30 a.m. Pilecki adjusted his identification papers one last time, making sure everything appeared legitimate. He had spent weeks crafting his new identity, Tomasz Serafiński, a simple Warsaw resident with no known connection to the resistance. The story had to be believable because his life would depend on it. The plan was elegantly simple and absolutely terrifying. German authorities conducted regular street roundups, known as Lepankas, sweeping through Warsaw neighborhoods and arresting anyone who looked suspicious or simply happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. These random arrests fed the German camp system with a steady supply of slave laborers. All Pilecki had to do was make sure he got caught. He chose a corner near the Wilson Square, where resistance intelligence indicated a major roundup was planned for that morning. At exactly 8 a.m., he would be walking past with falsified papers identifying him as unemployed, the perfect target for forced labor. The irony wasn't lost on him. For months, he had dodged German patrols, hidden from Gestapo searches, and developed elaborate techniques to avoid arrest. Now he was deliberately throwing himself into their hands. But what if they suspected he was a resistance officer? The Gestapo had sophisticated interrogation techniques. Under torture, even the strongest men broke eventually. If they discovered his real identity before he reached Auschwitz, he would be executed in Warsaw, and his mission would die with him. That's why the false identity had to be perfect. Tomasz Serafiński needed a complete backstory, verification documents, and most importantly, a reason for being unemployed that wouldn't arouse suspicion. They settled on making him a former shop clerk whose business had been closed by German authorities, common enough to be believable, innocent enough to avoid immediate execution. As Pilecki waited on that September morning, watching German soldiers position themselves for the roundup, his mind raced through everything that could go wrong. What if they sent him to a different camp? What if they decided he was too old for labor and shot him immediately? What if his wife and children were arrested in retaliation? But then he thought about the letters from Auschwitz. The desperate scrawls smuggled out by prisoners who were already dead by the time their words reached Warsaw. The accounts of men being worked to death, of medical experiments, of a systematic attempt to destroy not just bodies but souls. If even half of it was true, the world needed to know. And if no one else would find out, then Witold Pilecki would. 8:47 a.m. Wilson Square. Papers. Now. The German soldier's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Around Pilecki, dozens of Warsaw residents fumbled for their identification documents, fear etched on their faces. This was the moment, months of planning condensed into a single heartbeat. Pilecki handed over his forged papers with what he hoped looked like the nervous compliance of an ordinary citizen. Inside, his heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands remained steady. The soldier examined the documents with bored efficiency. Name, Tomasz Serafiński. Age, 39, 9 years younger than his real age, hopefully young enough for forced labor. Occupation, former shopkeeper, currently unemployed. Unemployed. The soldier's eyes narrowed slightly. The authorities closed my shop 3 months ago, Pilecki replied in what he hoped sounded like the defeated tone of a man whose life had been destroyed by circumstances beyond his control. I've been looking for work, but, he let the sentence trail off with a helpless shrug. The soldier grunted and moved to the next man in line. It was working. Pilecki allowed himself to breathe normally again as he was herded with about 60 other men toward the waiting trucks. Around him, genuine prisoners wept or prayed or stared in stunned silence at the familiar streets they might never see again. But Pilecki felt something unexpected: relief. After months of planning and worrying, the mission had finally begun. Whatever happened next, he was committed. There could be no second thoughts, no turning back. The truck lurched into motion, carrying its human cargo toward the Powiat prison, where new arrivals were processed before being sent to various camps throughout the German Reich. Pilecki pressed his face against the small barred window, watching Warsaw disappear behind him. He thought about Maria and the children, probably just now discovering that he hadn't returned from his morning errand. By tonight, they would know he'd been arrested. The resistance would assume he'd been betrayed or made a mistake. Only a handful of people knew the truth. Witold Pilecki hadn't been arrested by accident. He had walked deliberately into the mouth of the beast, carrying with him nothing but a desperate hope that he might somehow survive to tell the world what he found there. The truck turned a corner, and Warsaw vanished completely. There was no going back now. The most dangerous mission of World War II had begun. The Pauillac prison stank of fear, unwashed bodies, and something else Pilecki couldn't identify, something sweet and sickening that made his stomach churn. As the new prisoners were processed, he got his first real taste of German efficiency. Names were barked. Numbers assigned. Personal belongings confiscated and catalogued with meticulous precision. The guards moved with practiced brutality, striking anyone who moved too slowly or spoke without permission. This wasn't random cruelty, it was systematic dehumanization, designed to break spirits before bodies. Pilecki watched it all with the trained eye of a military officer, memorizing details he knew might become crucial later. Guard rotations. Daily routines. Which prisoners seemed to have survived longest and how they managed it. But he also had to play his role perfectly. Tomasz Serafiński would be terrified, confused, desperate to avoid notice. He couldn't appear too observant or too composed. One suspicious guard could end the mission before it truly began. "You, with the mustache." A guard pointed at Pilecki. "What did you do before the war?" "I owned a small shop, sir," Pilecki replied, affecting the servile tone he'd practiced. "Fabric and notions. The authorities closed it down, and I couldn't find other work." The guard studied him for a moment, then made a note on his clipboard. "Skilled tradesman. Good. You'll be useful." Useful. The word sent a chill down Pilecki's spine. Useful meant valuable enough to keep alive, at least temporarily. But it also meant he'd be expected to work harder, which in a German camp could mean the difference between survival and death. 3 days in Pauillac taught him lessons no amount of training could have provided. He learned to eat watery soup that tasted like dishwater but contained just enough nutrients to prevent immediate starvation. He learned to sleep on concrete floors crowded with bodies, ignoring the moans and whimpers of men slowly losing their minds. Most importantly, he learned to become invisible. The trick was to be unremarkable. Not so weak that you appeared useless, but not so strong that you attracted attention. Not so intelligent that guards suspected you of planning something, but not so stupid that you made fatal mistakes. It was a delicate balance that thousands of men had failed to achieve. On his third night, Pilecki witnessed his first execution. A prisoner had been caught hiding a small piece of bread, probably saving it for a moment when the hunger became unbearable. The guards dragged him to the courtyard and shot him in the head while the other prisoners were forced to watch. As the man's body crumpled to the ground, Pilecki felt something fundamental shift inside him. This wasn't war as he had known it in 1920, with uniforms and battle lines and at least the pretense of honor. This was something else entirely, an attempt to strip away every trace of human dignity and replace it with pure terror. That night, he wrote his first mental report. The German system is designed not just to kill prisoners, but to destroy their humanity first. They want us to become animals before they slaughter us. The psychological warfare is as systematic as the physical. It was information that would prove invaluable later, but first he had to live long enough to use it. June 14, 1941. Dawn. All prisoners. Outside. Quickly. The shout that woke Pilecki from his fitful sleep carried a different urgency than the usual morning commands. Around him, men scrambled to their feet, grabbing the few possessions they'd been allowed to keep. Something was happening. In the courtyard, they were lined up in groups of 50 and counted with German precision. Then came the announcement that made Pilecki's heart race with a mixture of dread and anticipation. "You are being transferred to Konzentrationslager Auschwitz for labor deployment. Any attempt to escape will result in immediate execution." After 9 months in Pauillac, his destination was finally confirmed. The mission that had seemed like an impossible gamble was about to enter its most crucial phase. The cattle cars were worse than anything Pilecki had experienced. 80 men crammed into a space designed for livestock, with a single bucket for sanitation and no food or water for what the guards promised would be a short journey. The train pulled out of Warsaw as the sun climbed higher, and Pilecki found himself pressed against the wooden wall, able to glimpse the Polish countryside through a small gap between boards. But this wasn't the Poland he remembered. Even through the narrow opening, he could see the signs of occupation everywhere. German road signs. Wehrmacht checkpoints. Polish towns with their names changed to German ones. His homeland had been systematically erased and replaced with something alien and hostile. The man pressed against his left shoulder was whispering prayers in Latin. The one on his right was softly singing a Polish lullaby, tears streaming down his face. Pilecki closed his eyes and tried to center himself mentally. You volunteered for this. You chose this. Remember why. The reports from Auschwitz had described horrors beyond imagination, but they had also described something else, a vast network of prisoners from across occupied Europe. Polish intellectuals, French resistance fighters, Czech patriots, Jewish families from Germany and Austria. If even a fraction of the accounts were true, Auschwitz contained representatives of nearly every nationality under German occupation. That meant witnesses. Lots of them. If he could organize them, document their experiences, and somehow get word to the outside world, the impact would be enormous. The Allies would have to believe testimony from hundreds of different sources, but first, he had to survive the camp itself. As the train rattled southward through the afternoon heat, Pilecki began planning. His military training had taught him that the first 24 hours in any hostile environment were crucial. You either established yourself as someone who could survive, or you became another casualty. The question was, what kind of prisoner should Tomasz Serafiński become? Too aggressive, and the guards would single him out for special treatment. Too passive, and other prisoners would see him as weak and expendable. Too clever, and someone might suspect he wasn't what he appeared to be. He needed to find allies quickly, men who had been in the camp long enough to understand how it functioned, but who still retained enough humanity to be trustworthy. He needed to establish a reputation as useful but not threatening. Most importantly, he needed to begin documenting everything from the moment he arrived. The train began to slow. Through the gap in the boards, Pilecki caught sight of a platform, guards with dogs, and something that made his blood run cold, a sign in German and Polish. After 9 months of planning and preparation, Captain Witold Pilecki was about to walk through the gates of hell. June 14, 1941. For 30 p.m., the cattle car doors slammed open with a crash that seemed to shake the entire train. Sunlight flooded in, blinding after hours in the darkness, and with it came sounds that would haunt Pilecki's dreams for the rest of his life. Raus! Raus! Schnell! German guards screamed commands while dogs barked and prisoners stumbled out onto the platform. The weak fell and were beaten. The slow were kicked. Anyone who showed the slightest hesitation was clubbed with rifle butts until they moved. Pilecki forced himself to stumble like the others, playing the role of a terrified shopkeeper even as his military training catalogued every detail. Guard positions. Weapons. Escape routes. Weaknesses in the perimeter. Information that might prove crucial later, if there was a later, but nothing had prepared him for the smell. It hit like a physical blow: smoke, human waste, rotting flesh, and underneath it all, something sweet and cloying that made his throat close up. This wasn't just a prison or even a labor camp. This was something far worse. The march from the railway platform to the camp proper took 20 minutes through the town of Auschwitz, known to the Germans as Auschwitz. Polish residents lined the streets, some weeping openly as they watched the prisoners stumble past. Others turned away, unable to bear the sight. An old woman pressed against a fence caught Pilecki's eye. She was holding a rosary and mouthing what looked like a prayer. For just a moment, their eyes met, and he saw in her face something he desperately needed, the knowledge that not all of Poland had forgotten its sons. Then the gates came into view. The infamous iron letters spelled out their mocking promise: Arbeit macht frei. Work makes free. Even in his exhausted, fearful state, Pilecki felt a surge of bitter anger. The lie was so brazen, so cruel, that it revealed the German mentality more clearly than any intelligence report. They didn't just want to kill their prisoners. They wanted to break them first, to make them complicit in their own destruction by holding out false hope. It was psychological warfare raised to the level of an art form. As the gates closed behind him with a final, echoing clang, Pilecki felt the weight of his situation settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He was inside Auschwitz now, prisoner number 4859 in the German system. Tomasz Serafiński, unemployed shopkeeper, was about to disappear completely, but Captain Witold Pilecki, resistance officer and voluntary spy, was just beginning his most important mission. The welcome began immediately. New prisoners were herded into a large room where guards screamed instructions in German while prisoners who had been there longer translated in desperate whispers. Strip. Shower. Delousing. Uniform assignment. Number tattooing. It was designed to be as humiliating and disorienting as possible. Men who had been professors, doctors, priests, and officers were reduced to naked, shivering animals competing for scraps of clothing and bowls of soup that tasted like dishwater. Pilecki submitted to it all while memorizing every detail. The guards who seemed most brutal. The prisoners who had clearly learned how to survive. The unwritten rules that could mean the difference between life and death. His new uniform was striped gray and blue, already stained with the blood and sweat of previous owners. The wooden clogs were too small, but he didn't dare complain. The red triangle sewn onto his jacket identified him as a political prisoner, one step above the yellow triangles worn by Jewish prisoners, but far below the green triangles of the criminal prisoners who often served as capos and block leaders. Number 4859. That's what he was now. Not Tomasz Serafiński and certainly not Witold Pilecki. Just a number to be worked, starved, and eventually discarded when his usefulness expired. His first barracks assignment was Block 8, a long, low building crammed with 3-tier wooden bunks. Each bunk was designed for one person but housed 3. The straw mattresses were thin and crawling with lice. The single blanket per bunk was threadbare and stinking, but it was the prisoners themselves that shocked him most. These weren't the hardened criminals or political fanatics he had expected. Most were ordinary men, teachers, shopkeepers, clerks, farmers, who had been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time or committed minor infractions against German authority. They looked like walking skeletons, their eyes hollow, their movements slow and careful. "How long have you been here?" Pilecki whispered to the men in the bunk below him. "Time doesn't exist here," came the reply. "There's only today and maybe tomorrow. Don't think about anything else, or you'll go crazy." That first night, lying on the narrow bunk with 2 other men, Pilecki listened to the sounds of Auschwitz, the moans of sick prisoners, the whispered prayers, the occasional scream from somewhere in the darkness. But underneath it all was a constant, low humming that seemed to come from the very walls. It was the sound of human beings slowly dying. And in that moment, Pilecki understood with perfect clarity why he had volunteered for this mission. The world needed to know. Not just about the brutality or the starvation or the systematic murder. They needed to understand that Auschwitz was an attack on the very concept of human dignity. The Germans weren't just killing people. They were trying to prove that civilization itself was a lie, that under enough pressure, anyone could be reduced to an animal fighting for scraps. He closed his eyes and began to compose his first real report. Day 1. The system is more sophisticated than we imagined. This isn't just about murder, it's about proving that humanity itself is a fiction. They want to break us completely before they kill us. But even as he documented the horror, Pilecki felt something else stirring in his chest: defiance. If the Germans wanted to prove that men could be reduced to animals, then he would prove them wrong. He would survive. He would resist. He would bear witness, and somehow, he would get word to the outside world. Week 2, July 1941. The key to survival in Auschwitz, Pilecki quickly learned, was becoming a ghost. Not literally invisible, that was impossible in a camp where prisoners were constantly counted, watched, and worked to exhaustion. But invisible in the way that mattered most, not standing out to the guards or capos who held the power of life and death, too strong, and they'd assign you to the worst work details. The rock quarry where prisoners hauled stones until their bodies gave out. The punishment battalion where men were worked 20 hours a day until they died on their feet. The medical experiments where Dr. Joseph Mengele and his colleagues treated human beings like laboratory animals, too weak, and they'd select you for special treatment. The euphemism that everyone understood meant the gas chambers that the prisoners whispered about but had never seen with their own eyes. The perfect position was somewhere in the middle, strong enough to work, but not so strong that you attracted attention. Clever enough to avoid fatal mistakes, but not so clever that someone suspected you of planning something. Pilecki mastered this balance with the instincts of a career military officer. He volunteered for kitchen duty, hard work, but it came with access to extra scraps of food. He made himself useful to older prisoners who had been in the camp longer and understood its hidden rules. Most importantly, he began to map the social networks that determined who lived and who died. The camp was a complex ecosystem of power and survival. At the top were the German SS guards, who could kill any prisoner on a whim. Below them were the capos, prisoners who had been given authority over other prisoners in exchange for better treatment. Most capos were criminals or long-term prisoners who had learned that brutality toward their fellow inmates was the price of staying alive. Then came the informal hierarchies among the prisoners themselves. Political prisoners looked down on common criminals. Veterans of earlier arrests had advantages over new arrivals. Prisoners with useful skills, doctors, mechanics, electricians, were more likely to survive than those with no special abilities, but there was another network, almost invisible but crucial, the resistance. It started with small acts of defiance. A prisoner slipping an extra piece of bread to someone who was starving. A doctor falsifying medical records to save someone from a deadly work assignment. A mechanic sabotaging equipment in ways that couldn't be traced back to him. Pilecki began to identify the men who were still fighting back, even in this environment of total oppression. They were careful, subtle, and paranoid. They had to be. Discovery meant immediate execution, often preceded by torture designed to expose other members of the network, but they were also desperate for leadership. Many of these men had been in Auschwitz for months or even years. They had learned to survive, but they had lost hope of anything beyond survival. They needed someone who still believed that the war could be won, that the camp could be resisted, that their suffering had meaning beyond the German desire to break them. Slowly, carefully, Pilecki began to make contact. August 1941, Block 8, Barracks 12A. The conversation that would change everything began with a crust of bread. Stefan Bilecki had been watching Pilecki for weeks, the new prisoner who never complained, never broke down, never seemed to lose hope even as men around him died daily. When Bilecki offered to share his meager evening ration, it was a test. In Auschwitz, food was life itself. A man who shared his bread was either suicidal or someone who understood that survival sometimes meant thinking beyond your own immediate needs. Pilecki accepted the bread and immediately broke it in half, giving the larger piece back to Bilecki. The message was clear: I understand the gift you're offering, and I'm offering something in return. That night, speaking in whispers while their bunkmates slept, they began to plan what would become known as WWII, Związek Organizacji Wojskowych, Union of Military Organizations. Bilecki had been a sergeant in the Polish army before his arrest. He knew dozens of other military prisoners scattered throughout the camp, men who retained their discipline and training despite months of systematic brutalization. If they could be organized, coordinated, and given a sense of purpose beyond mere survival, what do you propose? Bilecki whispered. Pilecki outlined his vision in careful, measured words. An intelligence network that could document everything happening in the camp. A communications system that could get messages to the outside world. A resistance cell that could commit sabotage without being detected. Most importantly, a support system that could help good men survive long enough to be useful. But Bilecki had been in Auschwitz longer. He understood the risks better than the newcomer. They have informants everywhere, he warned. Prisoners who trade information for extra food or better work assignments. One mistake, one person who can't be trusted, and we all end up in the gas chambers. Pilecki nodded. He had assumed as much. In his months in the Warsaw Resistance, he had learned that paranoia wasn't a weakness, it was a survival skill. Any organization they built would have to be compartmentalized, with each member knowing only what they absolutely needed to know. The recruitment process was agonizingly slow. They looked for men who still had the bearing of soldiers, who helped other prisoners even when it cost them personally, who showed signs of retaining their moral compass despite months of dehumanization. Former officers were obvious choices, but they were also obvious targets for German surveillance. Professional soldiers knew how to follow orders and keep secrets, but they also tended to think in terms of conventional military tactics that wouldn't work in a concentration camp. More valuable were the survivors, men who had learned to navigate the camp's brutal hierarchy while keeping their humanity intact. A doctor who falsified medical records to save lives. A mechanic who slowed down production without getting caught. A clerk who lost paperwork that might have sent prisoners to worse fates. One by one, cell by cell, WWII began to take shape. September 1941, the laundry detail. Working in the camp laundry was considered one of the better assignments, indoors, out of the weather, with occasional opportunities to organize, the camp term for stealing, small items that could be traded for food. But for Pilecki, it offered something more valuable: access to information. Clothes told stories. The bloodstains on a guard's uniform. The burn marks on a prisoner's shirt from the crematorium detail. The documents sometimes left in pockets that revealed details about camp operations, guard schedules, and most importantly, numbers. How many prisoners had arrived that week? How many had died? Where were they coming from? The German administration kept meticulous records of everything, but those records were carefully guarded. However, the prisoners who handled the laundry, cleaned the offices, and maintained the facility saw fragments of the larger picture. Pilecki began to piece those fragments together systematically. He memorized guard rotations, noted which officers drank heavily and might be susceptible to bribery, tracked the flow of supplies that revealed the camp's dependencies and vulnerabilities. Most importantly, he began to document the true scope of what was happening at Auschwitz. The numbers were staggering. Thousands of people arriving every week on cattle trains from across occupied Europe. Hundreds dying daily from starvation, disease, exhaustion, or outright murder. And increasingly, something new, large groups of people who arrived and seemed to disappear completely within hours. The gas chambers were no longer a whispered rumor. They were an industrial operation. Pilecki watched one day as a transport of Jewish families from Slovakia arrived. Men, women, children, elderly grandparents, all told they were being relocated to work camps in the east. They carried suitcases and bundles, still believing the German lies about resettlement. He never saw them again. That night, working by memory in the darkness of his barracks, Pilecki composed his first comprehensive intelligence report. He documented the camp's layout, its personnel, its methods of operation, and most crucially, its true purpose. Auschwitz is not primarily a labor camp, though labor is extracted from prisoners until they die from exhaustion. It is not primarily a prison, though many are held here for political crimes. Auschwitz is a factory. Its product is death, and it is operating at maximum efficiency. But how could he get this information to the outside world? The German security was sophisticated and ruthless. Mail was censored when it was allowed at all. Visitors were forbidden. Escape attempts were punished by the execution of 10 other prisoners, making them acts of mass murder rather than individual heroism. Yet somehow, word had to get out. The world had to know what was happening behind the barbed wire and the guard towers. Pilecki began to plan the most dangerous part of his mission, establishing communication with the resistance forces outside the camp. October 1941, the bread connection. The breakthrough came through Helena Plotnicka, a local Polish woman who ran a small bakery in the town of Auschwitz. Officially, she supplied bread to the German administration. Unofficially, she had been quietly helping prisoners for months, slipping extra food to work details and smuggling out letters when she could. Making contact with her required a chain of connections that took weeks to establish. A prisoner on the bakery detail who had noticed her sympathetic behavior. A capo who could be trusted not to report suspicious activity. A guard who could be bribed to look the other way at the right moment. The risk was enormous. Discovery would mean death not just for Pilecki and his co-conspirators, but for Helena and potentially her entire family. The Germans had made it clear that assisting prisoners was a capital offense. But Helena understood what was at stake. When the first carefully coded message reached her, hidden in the false bottom of an empty bread basket, she didn't hesitate. Within days, Pilecki's intelligence reports were making their way through a network of resistance contacts toward Warsaw and, ultimately, London. The reports were written on tissue-thin paper using a form of invisible ink made from crushed aspirin and water, a technique Pilecki had learned in his intelligence training. The writing appeared blank until heated, revealing detailed descriptions of camp operations, prisoner numbers, and German plans. October 15, 1941, concentration camp Auschwitz contains approximately 15,000 prisoners as of this date. Daily mortality averages 300 to 400 prisoners from various causes including execution, medical experimentation, starvation, and systematic murder of Jewish transports. Camp is being expanded rapidly to accommodate increased numbers. November 3, 1941, have confirmed existence of gas chambers disguised as shower facilities. Entire transports of Jewish prisoners are murdered within hours of arrival. Bodies are burned in specially constructed crematoria. German efficiency in mass murder exceeds all previous estimates. Each report was more detailed than the last, filled with information that would have been impossible to obtain except from someone living inside the camp system. Guard names and schedules. Technical details about the murder apparatus. Escape routes and security vulnerabilities, but the most important information was also the hardest to communicate: the scale. Numbers could be written and transmitted. The systematic nature of the killing could be documented. But how do you convey the atmosphere of a place designed to destroy human souls? How do you explain what it feels like to watch civilization itself being torn apart, one person at a time? Pilecki tried to capture this in his reports, but he knew that no amount of written description could prepare the outside world for the reality of what the Germans had created. He needed to do more than document the horror. He needed to survive it himself, and help others survive it, until the war ended and the world could see Auschwitz with their own eyes. But first, he had to deal with an immediate crisis. Someone in the resistance network had been compromised. December 1941, the interrogation. The arrest came without warning, as they always did in Auschwitz. Stefan Bielecki simply failed to appear for morning roll call, and by evening everyone in ZOW knew what had happened. The Gestapo had him. Bielecki felt his stomach drop as the implications hit home. Bielecki knew too much, not everything, but enough to destroy the entire resistance network if he broke under torture. Names, locations, methods of communication, future plans. Everything they had built over months of careful work could be exposed in a matter of hours. The question was, how long could Bielecki hold out? Different men had different breaking points. Some lasted days, others only minutes. The Gestapo interrogators were experts at finding psychological pressure points and exploiting them ruthlessly. They would use Bielecki's knowledge of his family, his comrades, his own moral convictions against him until something gave way. That night, Bielecki called an emergency meeting of the remaining cell leaders. Speaking in whispers in the camp latrine, one of the few places guards rarely ventured, they made the painful decision to assume the worst. All current operations were suspended. Communication channels were changed. Prisoners who might be compromised were warned to prepare for arrest. But they couldn't simply shut down and wait. The intelligence reports were too important, and the outside world was finally beginning to take them seriously. Recent messages from London had indicated that Bielecki's reports were reaching the highest levels of British intelligence and were being shared with American officials. The solution was to accelerate everything. If the network was about to be exposed, they needed to get as much information out as possible before the crackdown began. For 3 days and nights, Bielecki worked feverishly to complete a comprehensive report on everything he had learned about Auschwitz. Camp layout and personnel. Daily routines and security procedures. The full scope of the murder operations. Names of guards who might be vulnerable to recruitment or blackmail. Plans for expansion that suggested the killing would only increase. The document was over 50 pages long when written in full, but it had to be condensed into a form that could be memorized and transmitted orally. Key facts, crucial numbers, essential details that would allow the Allies to understand what they were dealing with. On the fourth day, Bielecki returned. He was barely recognizable, face swollen beyond recognition, several teeth missing, one arm hanging at an unnatural angle. But he was alive, and more importantly, he had revealed nothing that could compromise the network. They kept asking about resistance activities, he whispered to Bielecki during the evening meal. I told them I was just trying to survive, that I didn't know anything about organized opposition. I don't think they believed me, but they couldn't prove otherwise. The relief was enormous, but Bielecki knew they had been lucky. Next time, they might not be so fortunate. The network needed better security protocols, more compartmentalization, and above all, more ways to get information out, because the most shocking discoveries were yet to come. Spring 1942, witnessing the unthinkable by his second spring in Auschwitz, Bielecki had seen enough to understand that what was happening went beyond anything the outside world had imagined. This wasn't just brutality or even systematic murder. It was something new in human history, industrial genocide. The numbers were staggering and growing daily. Transports arrived from across occupied Europe, Poland, France, Holland, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Greece. Hundreds of thousands of people, mostly Jewish families, told they were being relocated for work assignments in the East. The reality was very different. Most never lived to see their first night in the camp. Bielecki had managed to get himself assigned to the Sonderkommando for a brief period, the special work detail that handled the gas chambers and crematoriums. It was considered the worst assignment in the camp, but it also provided the clearest view of the German murder apparatus. What he saw there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The victims were told they were going to shower in delousing facilities. They were ordered to undress and hang their clothes on numbered hooks, with assurances that they could reclaim their belongings afterward. Mothers comforted crying children. Elderly men and women moved slowly but obediently toward what they believed were washroom facilities. Then the doors were sealed and the gas was released. The killing took between 15 and 20 minutes. Afterward, the Sonderkommando prisoners, themselves doomed men who knew their own fate, had to extract the bodies, search them for hidden valuables, and transport them to the crematoriums for burning. The efficiency was terrifying. A transport of 2,000 people could be processed from arrival to cremation in less than 4 hours. The Germans had turned murder into an assembly line operation, with each step optimized for maximum throughput and minimum German manpower, but it was the personal details that made the horror truly comprehensible. Children's toys found in the pockets of coats. Photographs of families who would never be reunited. Wedding rings that had been worn for decades, now destined for German storage facilities. Love letters written in languages from across Europe, all ending in the same place. Pilecki documented everything with the methodical precision of a military intelligence officer. The capacity of the gas chambers. The daily throughput. The methods used to deceive victims until the final moment. The disposal of bodies and personal effects. April 18, 1942. Gas chambers now operating at maximum capacity. Conservative estimate of 6,000 people murdered daily during peak periods. Victims primarily Jewish families from Western Europe who appear to have no advance warning of their fate. German deception methods highly sophisticated. The reports grew more detailed and more horrifying with each transmission. By summer 1942, Pilecki was providing the Allied intelligence services with information that would later become crucial evidence for understanding the full scope of the Holocaust, but intelligence gathering wasn't enough anymore. As the killing accelerated, Pilecki began to plan something far more dangerous: active resistance from within the camp itself. August 1942, the resistance grows. Bold idea had been growing in Pilecki's mind for months. What if the prisoners didn't simply endure their fate passively? What if they fought back? It seemed insane. The prisoners were starved, diseased, and demoralized. They were watched constantly by guards with machine guns and attack dogs. Any serious resistance would be crushed instantly, and the reprisals would be horrific, but the alternative was to continue watching thousands die daily while doing nothing. The plan that emerged from weeks of careful discussion among ZOW leadership was audacious to the point of fantasy. They would coordinate a simultaneous uprising across multiple concentration camps, timed to coincide with an Allied parachute drop of weapons and supplies. The Polish resistance on the outside would attack German garrisons in the region, preventing reinforcements from reaching the camps. If everything went perfectly, and the chances of that were virtually zero, they might be able to liberate tens of thousands of prisoners and deal a devastating blow to the German war effort. The reality was more complex. Intelligence reports from the outside indicated that the Allies were focused on other priorities. The Americans were dealing with the war in the Pacific and preparing for operations in North Africa. The British were struggling with German U-boat attacks and planning their own offensive operations. The Soviet Union was fighting for its survival on the Eastern Front. A coordinated attack to liberate concentration camps was not high on anyone's agenda, no matter how detailed Pilecki's intelligence reports might be. But within Auschwitz, the resistance network had grown stronger than anyone had imagined possible. ZOW now included hundreds of prisoners across multiple camps in the Auschwitz complex. They had weapons hidden in various locations. They had detailed knowledge of German defensive positions and response procedures. Most importantly, they had men who were ready to die fighting rather than die passively. The debate within ZOW leadership was intense. Some argued that any uprising would be suicidal and would only result in mass executions without accomplishing anything meaningful. Others insisted that dying with weapons in their hands was preferable to waiting for their turn in the gas chambers. Pilecki found himself torn between his military instincts and his intelligence mission. As a soldier, he wanted to strike back at the enemy. As a spy, he knew that his survival and continued reporting were more valuable than any single act of resistance. The decision was made for them by events outside their control. In October 1942, word reached the camp that the Warsaw Ghetto was being liquidated. Hundreds of thousands of Polish Jews were being transported to extermination camps, most of them to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The killing apparatus that Pilecki had been documenting was about to be expanded to a scale that defied comprehension. If they were going to act, it had to be soon. Once the new transports began arriving, the German security would be tightened beyond anything they could overcome. But first, Pilecki had to make the most difficult decision of his military career: was he more valuable inside Auschwitz or outside it? March 1943, the moment of truth. For 2.5 years, Pilecki had been the perfect prisoner. He had survived disease, starvation, and countless opportunities for fatal mistakes. He had built an intelligence network that provided the Allies with unprecedented information about German atrocities. He had documented genocide with the precision of a trained observer and the courage of a man who knew he might not survive to tell the story. But by spring 1943, he faced a terrible choice. The resistance network inside Auschwitz was strong enough to survive without him. His intelligence reports had served their purpose. The outside world now knew the truth about the Nazi extermination program, even if they seemed unable or unwilling to act decisively to stop it. Meanwhile, the German security apparatus was closing in. Too many prisoners had been arrested for resistance activities. Too many informants had been planted among the inmates. Too many of Pilecki's closest associates had disappeared into the punishment blocks or the gas chambers. If he stayed much longer, he would almost certainly be discovered. And if he was discovered, not only would he die, but the torture would likely expose other members of ZOW, leading to a cascade of arrests and executions. The alternative was escape, something he had been planning in theoretical terms for months but had never seriously considered. Escape attempts were rare in Auschwitz, and successful ones were almost unheard of. The reprisals alone were usually enough to deter anyone from trying. For every prisoner who escaped, 10 others were selected for execution. It was a brutal calculus designed to turn the prisoners against each other and make any escape attempt an act of mass murder rather than individual heroism. But by early 1943, Pilecki had concluded that his mission had evolved. He had learned everything he could learn about Auschwitz from the inside. To be truly useful, he needed to get his detailed knowledge to the outside world directly, where he could brief military planners and political leaders face to face. The escape plan that finally emerged was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks. April 26, 1943, the bakery detailed the opportunity came during a routine work assignment at the German bakery outside the main camp. Pilecki and 2 other prisoners, Jan Redzig and Edward Shishelsky, were loading bread onto trucks when they noticed that one of the guards was drunk and the others were distracted by a group of female prisoners being marched past. For perhaps 30 seconds, they were unwatched. It was now or never. The 3 men slipped away from the loading dock, crawled under a parked truck, and then sprinted across an open field toward the forest that bordered the camp complex. Behind them, shouts and sirens began almost immediately, but by then they had reached the tree line and disappeared into the dense woods. The next 18 hours were a nightmare of running, hiding, and pure terror. German search parties with dogs combed the forest methodically. Aircraft flew overhead, looking for any sign of movement. Local police and Wehrmacht units set up roadblocks on every path leading away from the camp, but Pilecki had advantages the Germans didn't know about. During his time in the camp, he had memorized the local geography and identified potential safe houses among the Polish population. More importantly, he had arranged for civilian clothes and identity papers to be cached at specific locations by the outside resistance network. By dawn on April 27, Captain Witold Pilecki was a free man for the first time in 2 years and 7 months. He had escaped from Auschwitz, one of only 144 prisoners who would ever successfully do so out of the estimated 1.3 million who entered the camp, but his mission was far from over. Now came the hard part, convincing the world to care about what he had seen. May 1943, Warsaw, Free Poland. The reunion with his resistance colleagues was emotional but brief. There would be time for personal reconnections later. Right now, Pilecki had a story to tell that could change the course of the war. For 3 weeks, working 18 hours a day, he dictated his comprehensive report on Auschwitz to a team of stenographers and translators. The document grew to over 100 pages of single-spaced text, filled with details that no outside observer could have obtained. The Pilecki report, as it became known, was unlike anything the Allies had seen before. Previous intelligence about Nazi concentration camps had been fragmentary, often dismissed as propaganda or exaggeration. This was different, a systematic, detailed, first-hand account by a trained military observer who had lived inside the system for over 2 years. The report documented everything: the camp's organization and daily operations, the identities of key German personnel, the methods used for mass murder, the numbers of victims, the resistance networks among the prisoners, and perhaps most importantly, the psychological techniques used to break human spirits before destroying human bodies. But it was more than just an intelligence document. It was also a moral testimony, bearing witness to crimes that challenged the very foundations of human civilization. The Germans have created something new in human history, Pilecki wrote. This is not war as it has been understood for centuries, with battles between armies and rules governing the treatment of prisoners and civilians. This is a systematic attempt to destroy entire peoples, to erase them from existence as completely as if they had never been born. The report made its way through resistance channels to London, where it was translated into English and distributed to the highest levels of British and American intelligence. Copies were smuggled to the Vatican, to the World Jewish Congress, and to exile governments representing the occupied nations of Europe. The reaction was complicated. Military planners were fascinated by the intelligence value of Pilecki's observations. The detailed information about German security procedures, transportation networks, and personnel could be invaluable for planning sabotage operations and psychological warfare campaigns. Political leaders were more cautious. The scale of the atrocities described in the report was so enormous that many found it difficult to believe. Even those who accepted Pilecki's account as accurate wondered what could be done about it without diverting resources from the main war effort. The tragic irony was that Pilecki's mission had succeeded too well. His reports from inside Auschwitz had been so detailed and so horrifying that they exceeded the outside world's capacity to absorb and respond to them, but at least now the world knew. Whatever happened next, history could not claim ignorance about what the Nazis were doing behind the barbed wire and guard towers of their concentration camps. Pilecki's voluntary mission to Auschwitz was complete. But his war was far from over. Summer 1943, the next mission, freedom, Pilecki discovered, brought its own complications. After years of living under the constant threat of immediate death, the relative safety of liberated Warsaw felt surreal, almost dreamlike. He could walk outside without guards. He could eat meals without counting every crumb. He could sleep for entire nights without listening for the sound of boots in the corridor, but he could also remember everything he had left behind. The friends still trapped in Auschwitz. The resistance networks he had helped build. The thousands of prisoners who arrived daily on cattle trains, still believing German lies about resettlement and work camps. His escape had saved his own life and allowed him to bear witness to the world, but it had also condemned 10 other men to death in reprisal. The guilt was crushing at times, but Pilecki channeled it into action. If he couldn't save the people still inside Auschwitz, at least he could make sure their sacrifice contributed to the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany. His new assignment from the Polish resistance was to establish contact with Soviet forces advancing from the east and coordinate joint operations against German positions in occupied Poland. It should have been a straightforward military liaison mission, but like everything else in Pilecki's war, it became far more complicated. The Soviets, it turned out, had their own plans for post-war Poland. Plans that didn't include independent Polish resistance organizations or military officers who had demonstrated too much initiative and competence. By early 1944, it was becoming clear that Poland was going to be liberated from German occupation only to fall under Soviet domination. The country Pilecki had volunteered for Auschwitz to defend was going to disappear again, just as it had in 1939. But that was a problem for the future. For now, there was still a war to win against Nazi Germany, and Pilecki threw himself into the fight with the same intensity he had brought to his mission inside Auschwitz. He participated in the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, fighting house to house against German forces while the Soviet army waited outside the city, allowing the Germans to destroy the Polish resistance before moving in to establish their own control. When the uprising failed and Warsaw was reduced to rubble, Pilecki escaped to the west, where he spent the final months of the war with Polish forces fighting alongside the Western Allies. Victory in Europe came on May 8, 1945. But for Witold Pilecki, it felt more like a temporary pause in a larger struggle that was far from over. 1945-1948, the final betrayal. The war's end brought no peace for Witold Pilecki. As Allied armies swept across Europe in the spring of 1945, liberating one concentration camp after another and revealing the full scope of Nazi atrocities to a horrified world, Pilecki watched from exile in Italy as his beloved Poland disappeared once again, this time behind what Churchill would call an Iron Curtain. The Soviet-installed communist government in Warsaw was systematically eliminating anyone who might represent an alternative to their authority. Former resistance fighters, military officers, intellectuals, and political leaders were being arrested in the middle of the night, subjected to show trials that would have made Stalin proud, then either executed or sent to labor camps that differed from Nazi concentration camps mainly in their political justification. For Pilecki, the choice was agonizing but inevitable. He could remain safely in the West, where his reputation as a hero of the resistance guaranteed him a comfortable life and the gratitude of free nations. The British government had offered him citizenship and a military pension. American intelligence services wanted to hire him as a consultant on Soviet activities in Eastern Europe. He could have written his memoirs, given lectures, lived quietly as a celebrated survivor of humanity's darkest chapter, but tens of thousands of his countrymen were trapped behind the Iron Curtain, subjected to a new form of oppression that used many of the same techniques he had documented at Auschwitz. How could he enjoy freedom in the West while his fellow Poles suffered under another totalitarian regime? In December 1945, using false papers provided by sympathetic elements within the British intelligence service, Captain Witold Pilecki returned secretly to Poland. His mission was similar to what he had attempted at Auschwitz: infiltrate the system, document the crimes being committed, and get intelligence to the outside world that might prompt international intervention. But Poland in 1945 was not the same as Auschwitz in 1940. The communist authorities had learned from Nazi mistakes. Their security apparatus was more sophisticated, their surveillance more thorough, their methods of breaking opposition more refined. They didn't need to build extermination camps, they could simply make people disappear individually, quietly, with no witnesses and no records. Pilecki established contact with other former resistance fighters who had also chosen to stay and fight rather than flee to safety. Together, they began building a new intelligence network, this time focused on documenting Soviet crimes and getting information to the Western Allies about the reality of communist rule in Eastern Europe. The network they called NIE, Independence, gathered evidence of mass deportations to Soviet labor camps, show trials of former resistance heroes, the systematic destruction of Polish institutions, and the installation of a puppet government that took its orders from Moscow rather than serving the Polish people. But the Western Allies, exhausted by 6 years of global war, had little appetite for confronting their former Soviet allies. The reports that Pilecki and his colleagues risked their lives to compile received polite acknowledgement from British and American intelligence services, but no meaningful response. The men who had mobilized entire nations to fight Nazi tyranny seemed unable or unwilling to recognize that Soviet tyranny was simply wearing different uniforms while employing many of the same methods. President Harry Truman, dealing with domestic pressure to bring American troops home and facing new challenges in the Pacific with the emerging Cold War, reportedly told an aide, "I can't fight Stalin over every country in Eastern Europe. We've got our own problems to deal with." Winston Churchill, voted out of office before the war's end, could only watch helplessly as the alliance he had helped forge against Nazi Germany dissolved into suspicion and hostility between former allies. Meanwhile, the communist security services were closing in on Pilecki's network with methodical precision. Former resistance fighters were being arrested and tortured until they revealed names, addresses, and operational methods. The same techniques that Pilecki had survived at Auschwitz, systematic brutalization designed to break human will, were being employed by Poland's new masters against their own people. On May 8, 1947, exactly 2 years after Victory in Europe Day, Witold Pilecki was arrested for the final time. The end came at 2 a.m. in a Warsaw safe house where he had been meeting with other members of the NIE network. Security forces surrounded the building and burst in with overwhelming force, as if they were capturing a major military installation rather than arresting a handful of exhausted men who posed no physical threat to anyone. Pilecki was beaten unconscious during the arrest and woke up in a cell in the Mokotów prison, ironically, the same facility where many Polish resistance fighters had been tortured by the Germans during the occupation. The cells looked the same, smelled the same, even contained the same graffiti scratched into the walls by previous prisoners. Only the uniforms of the guards had changed. The interrogation that followed was conducted with professional expertise that rivaled anything the Gestapo had ever achieved. Colonel Józef Rozansky, chief of the Ministry of Public Security's Investigation Department, had studied German techniques and improved upon them. Physical torture was combined with psychological manipulation, sleep deprivation, and threats against family members to create a system designed to break even the strongest individuals. The trial that followed was a grotesque mockery of justice that would have made Nazi prosecutors proud. The man who had voluntarily entered Auschwitz to bear witness against genocide was accused of being a fascist spy and an enemy of the Polish people. His escape from Auschwitz was portrayed as evidence of collaboration with the Germans, as if any genuine prisoner would have been able to survive the camp for over 2 years without German assistance. His intelligence reports to the Western Allies were characterized as treason against the Polish state, even though those reports had helped document crimes that led to the conviction of Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg. The prosecutor, a young Communist Party member named Helena Wolinska who would later flee to Britain when her own crimes were discovered, delivered a closing argument that twisted every heroic act into evidence of treachery. The defendant claims to have been a patriot, but true patriots don't abandon their country in its hour of need. He claims to have been a resistance fighter, but true resistance fighters don't collaborate with capitalist intelligence services. He claims to have been a hero, but heroes don't betray the people they claim to serve. On May 25, 1948, Captain Witold Pilecki was executed by firing squad in the courtyard of Mokotów prison. The communist authorities buried his body in an unmarked grave somewhere in Warsaw and forbade any mention of his name in Polish media, history books, or official records. For over 40 years, the man who had provided the world with its first comprehensive report on the Holocaust was officially erased from Polish history, his existence denied, his heroism forgotten, his sacrifice ignored. His wife Maria was interrogated repeatedly, threatened with imprisonment herself, and eventually forced to publicly denounce her husband as a traitor, in order to protect their children from persecution. She died in 1989, just months before the fall of communism, never knowing that her husband would be vindicated and honored as one of Poland's greatest heroes. The final cruel irony was that Pilecki's execution took place in the same country he had risked everything to defend, carried out by people who claimed to represent Polish interests, justified by an ideology that portrayed his heroism as treason. The man who had walked voluntarily into Auschwitz because he believed that some truths were too important to remain hidden had been silenced by his own countrymen because the truths he revealed about communist oppression were too dangerous to be spoken aloud. But truth, as Pilecki had learned at Auschwitz, has a way of surviving even the most determined attempts to bury it. The legacy of courage. It wasn't until 1989, with the fall of communism in Poland, that Witold Pilecki's story could finally be told openly in his homeland. Archives were opened, survivors were interviewed, and historians began piecing together the full scope of his extraordinary life. What they discovered was even more remarkable than anyone had imagined. Pilecki's reports from Auschwitz had indeed reached the highest levels of Allied leadership during World War II. Winston Churchill had read them. Franklin Roosevelt had been briefed on their contents. The information had influenced Allied understanding of Nazi war crimes and contributed to the legal framework that would be used in the Nuremberg trials. But perhaps more importantly, Pilecki's example had inspired others to resist in ways both large and small. Prisoners in Auschwitz who learned about the resistance network he had helped build found the courage to sabotage German operations, protect fellow inmates, and maintain their humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. The question that haunted everyone who studied Pilecki's life was simple: how does someone find the courage to volunteer for hell itself? The answer, according to those who knew him, lay in his fundamental belief that some things were more important than individual survival. Freedom was worth dying for. Truth was worth suffering for. Human dignity was worth defending even when the odds were impossible. In 1995, Pilecki was posthumously promoted to colonel and awarded the Order of the White Eagle, Poland's highest decoration. In 2006, he was declared a righteous among the nations by Israel's Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial. In 2013, a statue was erected in his honor in Warsaw, but perhaps the most fitting memorial to Witold Pilecki is not carved in stone or cast in bronze. It's the simple recognition that in humanity's darkest hour, when civilization itself seemed to be collapsing into barbarism, ordinary people proved capable of extraordinary courage. A Polish cavalry officer chose to walk into Auschwitz not because he had to, but because someone had to bear witness, and in bearing witness, he proved that even in hell, the human spirit could not be completely broken. Captain Witold Pilecki volunteered for Auschwitz because he understood that some missions are too important to leave to someone else. He survived it because he never forgot that his suffering had a purpose beyond himself. And he died because he remained true to his principles even when those principles cost him everything. In a world that often seems short of heroes, Witold Pilecki's story reminds us that heroism isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and choosing to act anyway, because someone has to, and if not you, then who? The world's worst prison couldn't break him. Neither could a firing squad. His truth outlived his executioners. His courage outlived his tormentors. And his story continues to inspire anyone who faces the choice between comfortable silence and dangerous truth. Sometimes, the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with witness. Sometimes, the greatest victories come not from conquering enemies, but from refusing to let evil triumph in darkness and silence. Witold Pilecki chose the hardest path imaginable, and in choosing it, he lit a candle that darkness could never extinguish. That candle burns still. In the face of such overwhelming evil, one man's courage became a beacon of hope that continues to shine across the decades. Captain Witold Pilecki proved that even in humanity's darkest hour, there are those who will step forward and say, "Not on my watch." Not without witness. Not without resistance. His voluntary mission to Auschwitz stands as one of the most remarkable acts of moral courage in human history, a testament to the unbreakable power of the human spirit when it chooses truth over comfort, duty over safety, and hope over despair.